press record. Thank you for the reminder. Good evening, everyone. I am going to start my PowerPoint where tonight we are going to talk about good apiary hygiene, specifically drifting, but with a few other reminders as well. The year's work we will go over briefly. We will talk about feeding honeybees and the value of honey, pollen, water and propolis. So I will start this going and share. Do feel free to stop and ask questions if you feel I've not explained something enough. So anyway, all this stuff comes from module 1 of the BBKA modules. It's a honeybee management course that I've broken down into chunks. We don't go into quite the amount of detail you'd need for writing an exam. And I will just take this moment to point out the BBK modules can be done without you having passed the basic. They will be digital this year and they may be digital thereafter, but the end of the application time is the end of January. Steve Clark is coming into the room, as is Chris. So if you fancy doing a module, I would recommend you get a couple of books and do a lot of studying, because if you're going to do it, I'd like you to do it really well and get an excellent mark in it. I always feel that the studying is worth it on its own and you don't have to sit exams. But I'm a bit of a nerd who quite likes exams and things. So I will start this evening's session now. Apiary hygiene, we talked about this last time. This means having clean gloves, bee suit and hive tool, have a washing soda bucket on hand, a wax bucket for debris, and clean your gloves and hive tool between hives. If you've got 5 hives in an apiary, you should wash your hive tool after each one, and then you can put it away in your kit box clean. Do have a tea towel or kitchen roll to dry it on, or dry it on part of your bee suit that isn't filthy. I have watched someone thoroughly scrub their hive tool and then, whilst it was soaking wet and dripping washing soda, used it in their hive and thus dripped washing soda water all in their beehive. And I think that was completely horrible, and I don't think you should be doing that, because washing soda in honey would not be very good for you. And the main point of avoiding drifting is, if we go on to this slide, if you can imagine bees flying in from either direction and there's a crosswind, the bees are going to end up not in their own hive. And that means anything in the gut of that bee that's bacterially bad will end up in the hive of another hive. If you imagine the foragers going out, they leave their house where there might be a foul brood of some sort, or a virus, and they go out foraging and they come home and they get blown into the wrong hive. They unload their nectar crop to the bees in that hive, and that nectar gets turned into honey and it gets passed around all the bees, and the bugs that was in that gut are now within the other hive. And so we want to avoid drifting, and one of the ways we can do that is by making sure that our hives face different ways, that we don't have millions of hives all facing the same direction, we don't overburden our apiaries. And I know one of the Scottish bee farmers at the moment is posting pictures of his winter setups, which effectively look very similar to this, I think. Lots of hives in one place. And it is always a risk that if you have disease in one, it will spread through. So if you were going to have that many hives, you wouldn't want them all in one place, because it'd be unlikely there'd be enough forage. But the risk of disease spreading would be very high, just because the lightest of breezes is going to push the bees to the wrong hive. Or they may not get it right when they're coming home. They know they're about 1/8 from the right. They'll be counting the way back and they'll just miscount and they'll go into the wrong hive. And because they're flying back full of nectar or pollen, they will be accepted into that hive, because they will not be worried about it being the wrong hive, because it's a genuine mistake on their part. And they will land, they will get accepted into the hive, and there you go. That's that problem happening. in front of your very eyes, and you would know it was happening if you had a stronger crosswind, because the hives at one end would end up with more bees. So as you inspect, if your hives are in a straight line, and you start noticing that one of the hives at the end's a lot fuller than the others, that'll be because all the bees are being blown down to that end of the apiary. And so that's an indicator. So we want to avoid that where possible. But all the other things that we remind you about, the clean gloves, clean bee suit, clean hive tool, they're all really important too, because there's no point stopping the bees drifting if you're then going to contaminate hive to hive. And this is why we like to do a disease check as well.
If they do drift down and end up at one end, what do you do about it?
You would move it back to the other end. So you would in effect just swap the bees round. But what you should do as well is arrange the bees to stop them all ending up in the wrong hive again. So you could leave that hive where it was, and rearrange them all, and just be aware that one hive probably needs another super on, or two supers on, for all those extra bees. But make them at funny angles so that they're all facing different ways. You could have these all in a big semicircle, so they were more facing each other, so that when the bees come home, there's a definite difference in entrance direction. Some people paint them different colours, and that can be helpful. I think I said last time, some people put numbers on because bees can read, but they can count to a certain imagination, and they will work out which hive's theirs if there's not millions of them. But that big row, they're just going to go to wherever they end up.
I thought they weren't allowed in that they wouldn't let them into other hives.
If they were nervous, they get challenged. But if they genuinely think that they're going home, they won't be scared. They will just be confident. They will be laden down with nectar, and if they get challenged, they'll offer some nectar, because they genuinely think it's where they live.
All right, so it's really whether the bee is a good blagger.
Yeah.
Right.
When they're robbing, they're a lot more wavy going in. They'll sort of they know they're going into the wrong one when they're robbing, so they're a bit more devious about it. If they were just really confident and flew in, they'd probably get in.
Right. Okay.
So the other thing for hygiene is to make sure your equipment's bee tight, because if it's not, you can have wasps going in the autumn. But during a dearth, if there's a sudden end of a crop, then one hive might decide to go robbing another, especially if there's a really easy way in. And that can be dodgy corners, it can be floors breaking. You might have a gap in the roof. If you've not built your roof following the instructions right, there might be a really easy entrance in. And you'll see bees using a different entrance sometimes. And if you don't, and you go to your hive and you start inspecting it and they're a bit tetchy and you can't work out why, put it back together and just observe it from, not from the front, but perhaps from a back corner, and just keep an eye on all around the hive and see if there are bees using another entrance. But bees stealing honey from another hive is effectively a really good conduit for disease transmission as well. So we want to avoid that. And this is when it also pays to have lots of spare kit, because if you've got a damaged super, you could just swap it over with one not damaged and mend the broken one. And this is also a cause of disease transmission and bad hygiene. If you're transporting large numbers of bees around, which thank goodness we don't do really in the UK, but if you're going to transport bees up to the heather, then you need to have that apiary registered on the NBU site as a second apiary, because then if there's foul brood within 3 miles of it, or 3 kilometres, you'll get notified. So you'll know not to take your bees there, or maybe contact the bee inspector and say, will it be safe for me to take my bees there? And they'll be able to give you a better idea of whether you're at risk. But this migration of bees is how Varroa got around the country so quickly, because we do sell bees, we move them around for pollination services. If you've got heather moors fairly close, you might take bees to that. Paul's took bees to borage. All these things have risks associated with them, and we can do what we can to mitigate them. But if you're going to take huge vanfuls of bees around like they do in America, you are really asking for problems, and they have lots of other problems with their bees. They have something called colony collapse disorder. And I don't want to pin it on driving them around in big lorries and monocrops, but I think they have to be contributory factors.
I think most people in this country who do put hives into other areas generally just transport them themselves, their own.
Yeah.
I mean, this looks like something like a pigeon race going on, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's an enormous number of hives. And the reason this sort of lorry load normally comes into the news is because it's tipped over somewhere on the journey, and then we see millions of dead bees, and beekeepers locally going to the rescue to help upright all the hives. But I think there's not many people in the UK who have that many hives. There's some of the bee farmers have over 1,000, but not very many of them. But it is something to think about if you move hives, whether you move house or you just get a new apiary. There's always a disease risk associated with places, and that's why you should register with the MBU on BeeBase. And that's free, and you can get advice off your bee inspector for free as well. And in a normal year, they might come and do an inspection just to show that you've got no disease, and they are really good people. So apiary hygiene can involve keeping your kit clean. So we've talked about washing our gloves and hive tools. You can scorch your boxes to make sure they are thoroughly clean, and you need to take off runners so you can scorch underneath. But that's how you kill any spores of foul brood, by making sure they're really well torched. And if you do actually have foul brood in your hives, the bee inspector will scorch your boxes, and he'll be really, really good at it. And I think most people, when they scorch a box for the first time, are a bit tentative and worried about setting fire to the box. But you do need to scrape all the wax and propolis out, otherwise it can get quite a burn going. But if you buy second-hand kit, you might want to scorch it as well. It might be scorched before it's been sold. But there's nothing wrong with giving it a second scorch, and that's why I'd always recommend you buy new kit, just because it avoids this risk of disease transference. And the fact there's a spade there indicates someone's probably just dug a big hole in the ground as well for burning the frames in. But that's certainly something you could do every year. When on your kit you take off, you could, if you've got your brood box, you could scorch that, and then you'd know there'd be nothing in it if you're replacing a full set of comb, and it'd be a really shiny new box for next year, albeit looking quite dark inside.
Dan, this is maybe a bit of a dim question, but I've painted all my boxes, but only, well, my poly hive I've painted on the inside as well, but my wooden boxes I've painted on the outside. Could I still scorch them?
You can.
Risky.
You don't normally paint inside boxes.
No, I painted inside my poly hive.
I don't think you need to paint the inside of polyhives. The idea of painting the outside is to stop them being affected by the ultraviolet from the sun. They go yellow. That's what I thought it
was a weather effect. I thought it was like the moisture as well can degrade it.
I
think it's mostly UV, but I mean, to be honest, it also protects it if you're a bit clumsy with your hive tool and dig it in on the outside. If you scratch the outside. I don't recommend
you paint or need to paint the inside. I think it's the feeder.
My poly boxes they came painted, and they're not painted on the inside. If that's any help.
All right.
No, but the bees will cover it up if they don't like it. But you obviously don't scorch poly boxes. You bleach and scrub those, which I think is probably a bit more work than using a giant flamethrower like that.
So with the poly hives, you can use a handheld steamer, and that works very well.
Can you? Right.
Yes.
I will say, if you have a bellow hive, don't steam your crown board. And I will find the photo of my crown board that went in the steamer.
Yes,
But
they
the
warp.
normal polyhive,
Wooden things will warp, but
Yeah.
yes. But for the inside of boxes, the handheld steamer works very well.
Right.
Oh, I've got one of those.
But you can. I've used neat bleach on my polyhives and soaked it in neat bleach, and then scrubbed the neat bleach in with one of like a loo brush, toilet brush, or one of those little brushes you can buy to do your washing up with, and you scrub it neat, and then wash it off with a shower head in the shower, and it dries immaculately.
you really need to rinse that well, though, wouldn't you?
Yes.
You have to really.
There is a food grade bleach which can
That's
be
right,
used.
yeah.
Yes.
There is advice from the MBU about what percentage bleach to use, and I don't think they say to use concentrated bleach, but you're right, Francine, there's the food grade, do they call them sanitizers? Is that that what it is when it's food safe? Yeah.
The other thing, or something that smallholders and farmers use.
Yes. The other thing to bear in mind is that we don't need to get it back to the same condition as it was when it was brand new. The bees use propolis for a reason.
Yeah.
You know, so we want to have it clean because we may put different bees in the same box, etc. But we don't need to scrub it within an inch of its life and then get it completely, you know, mint again. It's not necessary.
And this is it. The guy here is presumably doing this because of foul brood, so they're being extra careful there. And on this picture, if you look closely, and you can see where the runners come off because there's very clean wood underneath, and they take them off because there can be bits of wax and honey and stuff just underneath them. So you take them off, so you're making sure the box is clean, and then you concentrate on the corners where there are crevices, that little tiny bits might be. Because the foul brood spores for American foul brood can live for 30 years as spores, which means that's a particularly bad thing. I will have to insert some cleaning of poly kit in this one for next time.
Yes. So yes, there are two different types of cleaning. There is your routine cleaning, and there is the cleaning if you've had foul brood. They are two different things.
BVKA, they recommend 10% dilution for the polyhives.
That's right.
Yeah, not full strength.
Yeah, but what's the strength of the original bleach?
Well, this is it. This is perhaps a discussion for later. I've got another 25 slides to get through, so I will. It's all right. I will amend this one, and we will cover a bit more of polyhives. So the year, the calendar. In January, we don't do very much. If we didn't do a December Varroa check in oxalic, we might do it in early January. But normally, I think people do the disease check in December, do a Varroa count, and then either vape the oxalic acid or do a dribble. And mid-March is when we start. We do our first inspection, and we take out that old comb we'd been hoping they'd eat all the honey in, and we'd ditch that, and we'd perhaps wash it and reclaim the frame if we were feeling tight. And you might need to feed in March if it's been that sort of year where they vet everything. Then make sure you feed them because they've got to get through until they're bringing enough in for them. The end of March, you might, if you're very, very lucky, get to put super on. I think that's yet to happen here in Oldham, but I know some people might have oilseed rape there, which might be starting to flower. April to July is our regular checks, where we're going to check every week. We're going to do our swarm control when we need to. We're going to keep plying the bees with supers. We're going to take off supers when they're full and extract them. And if we're lucky, we'll get a late spring crop, which is always lovely. And we might do another Varroa check. You should be doing 4 Varroa checks a year. In August, supers off, extract, and a lot of people give them the bees back to empty all the little bits of honey out. and that helps give them a little bit of food. We can do another disease check of the brood, which we'd have done in March as well. So that's when you shake the bees off the frames and have a look. And usually in September, we'd be doing an Apiguard treatment if that's what we want. Or you might want to do one of the others that are available. But the ones that have thymol and other essential oils in, you can't use with the supers on. And some of the other ones aren't recommended for ever having honey in those frames again. And so there's some of them that have the lipophilic chemicals in. You should do the year before you're going to do a big comb change. But we've talked about that in the Varroa session, and we'll probably go over it again. After August, we start feeding them up because we want them to have lots and lots of food for winter. If you've got balsam, they might be bringing in another couple of supers worth of honey still. So you might not want to do a thymol treatment if you've got lots of balsam. And you take your Varroa treatment off after 4 weeks for Apiguard, and there's some of the other Api-Life strip things that stay in for much longer, 6, 8, 10 weeks, some of them. But you have to read the instructions and follow the instructions on whatever treatments you do, and you also have to write them down in your drug sheet.
If you get spring honey,
yeah,
if you harvest some honey in the spring, and then you put the supers back with the queen excluder, then if they're going to make more honey, would you normally leave that honey for them for the winter? Take the queen excluder off?
If we're talking about April or May having took honey off, we would hope to get some more honey after that. A lot of people used to only get bramble honey as a crop, which is a sort of end of August crop. Some people are lucky enough to have oilseed rape and get a really good spring crop. And I think you can get an autumn crop if it's been sown at the right time of year. But generally, you might not get a crop in June, and you might not get very much in July, but by the end of August, you should have more honey.
And would you leave them that, say, for the winter?
They need somewhere between 28 and 40 pounds of honey, but they should be able to store that in a standard national brood box. Right, so you wouldn't need to leave them a super on, but a lot of people do. If they've only made one super of honey, then some people choose to leave that for the bees. There are other people who will say that honey's worth £8 a pound or £10 a pound, whatever they're charging for it, and the cost of sugar to replace it's very cheap compared to the value of the honey. So some people take all the honey off and then feed them massively, but you have to start the feeding a lot earlier if you're going to get them to fill a brood box with it.
But is the sugar going to be as nutritious for them as leaving some honey, for instance?
Almost certainly not. But when they're your bees and you want to make money off them, then that decision is with you and your bees. If your bees don't do as well over winter because you fed them sugar and stole their honey, that's an issue you've got to deal with. They will store pollen, and you don't take the pollen away, so they will have pollen. And they'll probably be bringing in pollen. If you've got Mahonian near you, they're probably bringing some of that in. I think our hive is finished, though, disappointingly early, I think. But there is some pollen at this time of year. There's just not very much nectar in any quantity once the hive is finished.
My bees, Diane, are bringing in pollen by shed loads at the moment.
Right. That you must have some really good planting near you. So
yeah, most of mine are up on farmers' fields, and in wood. I've got 5 hives in a load of woods as well. So we're obviously finding something around there locally. But I was up there today just to check the fondant I put on there to see what condition it was at, and I was just sat there watching them just bringing in shed loads of pollen on the back of their legs.
Yeah, we've had some pretty dismal weather, so I've not seen my bees flying today to see what they've been doing. It's been a bit cold as well. So this is the problem. Even if there's nice things out there, you do have to have the weather. One of the trees along the canal bank, I think it must be the beech, has got catkins on, and I suspect in the next 4 weeks they'll actually have pollen blowing out of them. And it's, you know, there's not a lot of demand for pollen at the moment, but they will bring it in if there's some good stuff out there. But there's not a lot of nectar at this time of year, so you have to have got all that feeding done before it gets this cold. So that is a rough summary of the year. After the end of September, you should probably be leaving your bees alone, other than to check your Varroa inspection board and to heft them and to make sure they've not been knocked over in the wind. And to that end, I always ratchet strap my hives, and I keep them strapped up all year, just because it's easier to have that hive strapped round the hive than a big tangle of them in a bucket somewhere waiting to go on in the autumn. And with the weather as it is, you never actually know if you're going to get a really big storm in the middle of summer. So the year is split up into different things, and hopefully during the summer you will get to put supers on and take a crop. And some years you don't get a very good crop at all because the weather's been absolutely rubbish. And if it's very hot and dry for a prolonged period, unless you've got big trees that are going to yield a crop, then you're not going to get anything, because all the shallow rooted plants need rain fairly regularly to be able to produce nectar. And if you have too much rain, the nectar that's there gets washed out. But you do 2 disease checks a year on your brood, 1 in spring and 1 in autumn, and you check your Varroa 4 times a year, and treat as necessary. And as someone said earlier, there are some people who don't treat for Varroa. So anyway, if you remember a session we did a while ago, we played with this XLS sheet and we wrote down all the things we have to do, and we wrote down when you're likely to have to do them. And I am going to put this on my webpage. And thank you to Paul for having tidied it up and made it look a bit neater. But it's something I think we'll do as an exercise again next year, just to go through all the different things, because it's a very interactive session we had, where everyone got a chance to suggest things and suggest when we do things. But I will share that. So Varroa treatments, there are lots of different sorts. This is an Apiguard tray, and I don't know why they have put what looks remarkably like a dummy board in a bag there, other than it is perhaps to stop the tray sitting right on top of the frames. But as it doesn't say you can't on the instructions, I wouldn't ever put something like that in the hive. I suspect the bees will be chewing that plastic. I've certainly got bees that are capable of pulling plastic bags out of the top. Having wrapped some fondant in plastic one year, and I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll go and take that plastic out of the roof. And I went and looked at the hive, and this really tatty bit of very yellow material being pulled out of the entrance. And it turns out the bees had got fed up of this piece of plastic in the roof, had chewed it, dragged it through the brood box and threw it out. They don't like rubbish in their hive. So that's one Varroa treatment.
Alternatively, they'll properly sit down.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I was probably quite lucky they just decided to throw it out the front door. For winter...
I tried one year putting rhubarb leaves in the top of the hive just to see what would happen, because like they say about it having natural oxalic acid in it. I know the oxalic acid is very little amount, but it was funny to watch that the following morning, virtually 3/4 of those leaves were out on the front floor.
Yeah.
They take them completely out.
Yeah, and I suspect some of the grooming behaviour that happens when there are foreign objects in the hive is where this idea that things like rhubarb leaves can, you know, be effective, because the bees don't like stuff in the hive that shouldn't be there, and they aim to get rid of it, and it perhaps agitates them more into cleaning each other as well. This picture is of a reduced entrance. You could use a proper mouse guard if you wanted, or if you're a bit handy with the drill and you've got the right size bit, you could make one of these. And I sort of quite like this idea because you just swap an entrance block then, don't you? But these are a different selection of mouse guards. I've got a couple of types. One that looks a bit like this metal one, but mine's obviously full width. I think they've cut that up to go across several different hives. And you're supposed to just drawing pin those on. And I don't know whether I'm just a complete wimp, but I find it really hard pushing drawing pins into cedar wood. I am not perhaps the strongest person on the planet, but I think this idea, oh, just drawing pin it on. No, it doesn't happen. So people quite often have full width entrance is that they've made modifications to that, just swap entrance blocks. And the issue with that is I've found that I have about 15 entrance blocks and I can try each one of them on a hive and none of them will fit, even though they all should, because they're all made to the same sort of rough dimensions. And it'll just be some floors sit a little closer or a little lower on the brood box. And you have to then get some serious sandpaper and make them fit better. But they're particularly scruffy looking bits of wood with metal things in. You could 3D print one. That's what I've got for a couple of my hives, some nice little 3D printed ones. And all they do is they've got little latches on that sit through either side of the entrance so that they sit on a sort of that size reduced entrance, and they stay in place and the bees can come and go as they want. But if you put your mouse guards on too soon, you will lose lots of pollen on your entrance as the bees squeeze through and these big lumps of pollen they bring on get knocked off. But that is much better than having mice living in your box over winter.
Coming back to the drawing pins, you can just gaffer tape your mouse guards to the hive. Yes, that would require being able to tear that off as well. I am a complete wimp. I really am. I've got poorly hands. But no, I have duct tape in my hive box. And yes, you're right. It's probably would just be much easier to duct tape things on than persist with drawing pins. Yes. If you want to fumigate your supers, there is a really nice leaflet about it on the MBU where you basically buy some really toxic substance that's called ethanoic acid, and you buy the 80% stuff that will melt through concrete. It will burn your eyes off. It will take your fingers and skin off. And you should wear a big rubber apron, gloves, goggles, face mask, everything. Don't mess about with it. But it will fumigate your supers if you do it right, and they will be free of all sorts of nasties.
And it eats itself through concrete as well. Yeah. So you have to be careful what you put it on.
Yes, and it'll make your house smell like a very bad chip shop as well. Your neighbours might not like it.
I use the sulfur dioxide from thorns. Yeah. That you put in the little smoker container. Yeah. You put it on the top of the frames. Yeah. So you put 6 supers up, and then you put it on top of the frames at the top on a tile that you would use for tiling, and then light it, put the lid on the top, and walk away. Yeah. And then just leave it.
And don't go and stand by it while it's doing it, because it's a bit. If you've ever sulfured your greenhouse, it's the same stuff as that, and it's really effective, and they're not very dear, are they? But you do have to put something under whatever you've lit it in. If you've got you can make a bean tin with a piece of wire as a hanger for hanging it in. But if you don't put something underneath, you will have a round burn mark on your super frames because it just gets quite warm.
What acid is it?
It's ethanoic acid. I will post the link to the leaflet because it is a very specific acid you need, and you probably can't get it through the post from very many suppliers because it's you normally have to go and collect it, don't you, Mark?
Yeah. But the sulfur dioxide one is really good. Yeah,
and that's just strips.
Yeah, you buy the strips from Thorns. They're about £7 for 100 strips. Yeah. And you can buy the little burner as well, which is about £5 or £6 from Thorn.
Or you can open a tin of beans, eat them,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
have a bit of wire. If you're a bit creative, you can make your own burner and save £7 and put it towards something
Would
else.
you be able to use that acid on polyhives? Or will the fumes, are they likely to burn into the polystyrene?
Do you know, I don't know. I think we will have to look into that.
No, I use, like I said, I use the sulfur dioxide one with my polyhives as well. I'll mix the polyhives with wooden hives in a stack of 6, and then put a brood box, empty brood box frame on the top of the snoopers, put a tile on top of the frame, so a kitchen tile, and then put the burner on top of that, and then just put the lid on top straight afterwards when it's lit, and then just let it do its business.
But there is a whole leaflet about fumigating them, so you don't. This is a bit of an overview. I will say, if you've got a nuke that's got the felt tearing off like that, why on earth would you take a photo off and put it in the course in the case? This is where this photo's from. If you've got kit like that, mend it, sort it out. So, as I said before, strap your hives down. It really does save them if it gets windy. And the ratchet straps are quite cheap. You can buy them from Screwfix, Tool Station, that sort of place. And on this hive, you can see the mouse guards in place.
The ratchet straps there don't go over the lid though, do they? The roof?
Yeah, that's what I was looking.
I do. I put mine over the lid. I don't want the lid coming off.
But not in that picture, it hasn't.
I know. I don't know whether they've done that so they can heft more accurately, because if you take the roof off, my hive roofs are quite heavy, and it would make it easier for me to heft to start rather than having to heft a roof as well. But I always ratchet round the roof, because if it's windy and it falls over, I want the roof staying on.
I think those straps are maybe just too short.
Yeah, possibly.
To get a pull, like to lock it.
The ones from Tool Station 4 for a tenner, I think, are really good, and they're really UV stable. Unlike the really cheap ones you can get, the black and red ones just sort of dissolve, and the yellow ones are barely worth taking out of the wrapper. There's some really thin, cheap yellow ones that just degrade within 6 weeks.
But it's not just wind, is it? I mean, I'm concerned about badgers, actually.
Yeah, and anything or likely to knock your hives over, whether that's horrible humans, sheep rubbing on it, deer, naughty badgers. What was that about an allotment?
I said we know there's a couple of badgers down at our allotments.
Right.
We've got foxes as well. That's why we have no rabbit problem. There's also a feral cat down there that I have fed because she's a good mouser.
Right.
But can I just ask something about this? You see this grass around here? I know it's a completely different subject, but I've always wondered how people cut the grass around the hives, because I would imagine if you go anywhere near them with a strimmer, they go on to DEFCON 1 and attack.
It depends on your bees. I have got bees that I can mow in front of and not be bothered. I can't use a strimmer, mostly because it sends my elbow off into absolute agony. But my husband can strim round the hives, and I always make him put a veil on, but he doesn't need a suit on. They don't attack him. I know some bees really don't like mowers, and if you were to bump the hive, ours are all on a flag, so they've got a bit of space around them, so you're not going right up to the wood to bump into it.
Yeah, I'm going to put mine, around the floor, I'm going to put wood chip. But we get down the allotment, we get wagon brings a load, so I'm going to put that round it, because I don't want to have to strim. You don't know until you first strim, do you?
No. If we get Asian hornets in this country living here properly, then we will all be letting the grass grow in front of our hives, because that gives the bees an easier way in, because the Asian hornets like to hawk in front, and the grass will stop them, but the bees are really nifty and will be able to work out how to get back to the hive. But the hawking behaviour of the Asian hornets relies on the entranceway being fairly open. And some of the French beekeepers have said they let all sorts of things grow in front because that protects the bees.
I only tidy up underneath my boxes because mine are up on stands on pallets. So I normally kind of like clean underneath, get all the grass and that underneath, and then I'll put a tile on in like a big floor tile. I'll stick that underneath the hive to stop the weeds growing up.
Yeah.
But I let everything grow in front of it because, like Diane said, the bees will find their way in, but nothing else hovering around.
And the wasps probably this autumn probably needed the distraction of grass just to make it harder for them.
Yeah.
Whereas bees are really, really clever and will know when they come out in the morning, which is the best way to get out and back in.
Yeah, I am a bit worried about wasps because I know there's wasps down there a lot.
Yeah.
There has been this summer. It's been terrible.
Yeah.
Just a pointer, if anybody wants any weed stopper to put underneath the hives or whatever, if you can get hold of the bit that goes in the middle of a trampoline, that is good stuff.
Yeah, I've got weed suppressant down under the
yeah, that weed suppressor, it rots after a while. If you can get hold of an old trampoline, that stuff doesn't.
I have found from years on the allotment that the problem with weed suppressant is they're all stable if they're covered up from the sun. The minute they are exposed, they start to rot and fray.
Well,
and the ones that fray at the edge are horrible.
I'm putting a couple of inches of wood chip on the top of them.
Yeah.
As long as it outlives me, and it probably will.
Yeah. So anyway, the next thing to worry about over winter is woodpeckers, and these are some prevention methods. The idea is it stops the woodpecker getting its beak near the hive, and that should protect them from attack. Because the woodpeckers, if you've got them in your area, it's definitely something to consider. And some people put 2 canes through the top so they can lift it off if they want to check for feed or heft or whatever during winter and just put it back on. But you wire the ends of the cages together, and that helps keep it at the right distance from the hive. If the wire's against the hive, then the woodpecker basically can just still peck on it. So it's the idea of a cage around it is just to provide a gap all around the hive.
Squirrels as well, I would think.
Say that again, Graham.
Squirrels as well, I would think.
They're not bothered about hives at all. I've not had any problems with squirrels. We have an awful lot on the allotment. They really like sweet corn. And there's a couple of people who didn't pick all their sweet corn. And so I've watched squirrels running off with half cobs. They can't seem to manage a full one, but they must eat half of it and then come back with the other half.
I thought there were going to be a problem because I know I watched a guy on, it was a YouTube video, it's an American guy.
They might not be the same squirrels as we've got.
Gravy, his polyhive had been chewed to bits by squirrels, but yeah.
Right.
I don't watch a lot of the American stuff because they're like all rednecks.
They have different problems as well.
Yeah.
We have had a third late flurry. I will just say to the people who've just arrived, you're very optimistic. It is 50 minutes after it started. We are still going though. So that's woodpecker protection. If you've got woodpeckers in your area, you will have heard them. So it might be something you want to consider.
I've actually found a green woodpecker sat on top of my hive when I went to inspect the other day.
Have
I
you?
went to have a look the other day, and he was actually sat on top of it. I thought, you little sod.
What have you got?
That's cheeky. I've heard them. I've never seen them. So hopefully there's plenty of other stuff for them to eat. Oxalic acid treatment you can do using a vaporizer, or the traditional way is you open the hive up and you give 5 ml of the correct solution per seam, and the instructions are on the packet. And I showed a video last time, I think it was, of someone using a torch to ascertain how many frames of bees there were. And so you don't, at this right hand side of this hive, you can see there's no bees on the top there. So it's unlikely there's bees on those frames. So you only treat the seams of bees, and it's 5 ml of this solution for each one. And you can either use a series of 5 ml syringes fully loaded, 1 per seam, Or if you're really clever, you can use a big 50 ml syringe and just remember to do 5 ml and don't get too enthusiastic and squirt it all on your first seam, because it will run out the bottom. It is sugar syrup as well, and it will attract other bees perhaps. But that is normally done in the middle of winter. So that's normally traditionally done between Christmas and New Year. And I think purely because that's when beekeepers have time off work and were able to do it. If you reckon your bees are going to be broodless at the start of December, do it at the start of December. If there's very cold weather, they'll be very highly clustered and they won't be making very much brood. And that's generally a good time to do it. Sorry, Graham.
What drizzle down? Just along the top? Will it drizzle all the way down the frame?
You do it between the frames, so on the seam of bees, and you just drizzle 5 ml along each seam, and the bees will lick it and clean it up because it's not overwhelming in volume.
All right.
And then
down the frame, will it?
The idea is the bees clean it up before it gets to the bottom.
Ah, right.
And then they ingest it and they pass it on to all the other bees because they all share food in the hive, and then that's how it gets round. It's not bathing them all in it. It's getting it into the.
I always wondered, I'd seen it on videos and I thought, how is that going to get any bees at the bottom? It's just going to, I thought it was like a shower, you know.
No, it's not like having a hairbrush on them all and brushing the varroa off. It is to get it into the system. They will clean each other up, ingest the solution and pass it on. But that's for the middle of winter.
It's a mild winter, and so you've still got quite a lot of brood going on.
Yeah, it's less effective.
But you'd still do it?
Yeah, most people would probably still do it because the alternative is vaporizing, and that's the main treatment you can do in the middle of winter. And if you knock some of the varroa down, it's better than knocking none of it down. But if you've checked your varroa levels and it's not very high anyway, then some people don't treat. But it is all about checking your bees. And there was something I read recently. There's reports about the amount of pesticides going into rivers and waterways that contains the chemical that we treat our cats and dogs for fleas with. And what the vets do is they say you must do this every month, and they sell you this expensive frontline stuff and Spot On and all the other types of stuff, whether your cats and dogs need it at all, because you can't insert a varroa board under a dog and leave it there for 2 days and see if any flea eggs fall off it or any fleas, and then you say, oh yeah, my dog's got fleas. And the alternative is you don't treat your cats and dogs until they do have signs of fleas, and then by the time you've noticed them, they've got really bad flea infestation, your house is full of it. It's some people are reactive because they count and see if they've got varroa, and some people count and don't do it if they don't think they've got enough. But there are some people who do it anyway. But it's the advice out there is count how many varroa they've got, use the MBU calculator, and then make the decision for your bees. Because if your bees died because of varroa, then that was something you could have treated for, so it would be a shame. But if your bees would live without you treating them, then that's better for your bees because they've not been subjected to chemicals. But it is this really difficult balancing act, and the Steve Martin document talks about people who don't treat and how that there are limited pockets of it, and these varroa resistant bees do really well in those areas. But if you move those bees to an area with a lot of varroa, they succumb to the varroa, which sort of says to me it's just there is a low incidence of varroa in the areas they're in, and that's why they can survive it, because there's not much of it. But you have to count and decide yourself. But there's advice out there on the MBU site about whether to treat. The less brood there is, the more effective this treatment is. And that's about all I can say, other than the scientists at Lassie go through on whatever day they do it in December, and they scratch open the brood, which might mean that brood's lost, but it means their varroa treatment's much, much more effective because there's no cat brood with varroa hiding in it. and that would be quite a lot of work, and it's not something I'd want to be doing in December, scratching open brood in my hive. I'd rather treat for varroa if I felt they needed it, and accept that it isn't going to be as good a treatment as if there was no brood. So if you can make a note of the weather going through the end of December, the minute it gets really, really cold, and especially at night, there's going to be virtually no brood being sort of made, because the colder it is, the more they contract. Go on, Chris. Chris wants to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say that what I've understood is I've got one of the vaporizers, which I'm going to use, but I've been told that, I understand that if you do like 5 days, then another 5 days, and then another 5 days, you will get over anything that's been within brood. Is that correct?
You would, however, the instructions on apabioxol say you can use it twice in a year.
Okay.
And so you would be going against the recommendation of the chemical treatment.
Okay.
But I understand why people say that, because they hope that the brood that's uncapped after the first application get caught by the second lot. But that persistent application of chemicals isn't legal and probably be recommended by anyone at MBU. It might be sort of on the slide, but it's a bit naughty when all the chemical treatments say, you can use this one twice a year, not 3 times in a row over Christmas.
Okay, thank you, Di. I've not got any yet, and I've not read the packet, obviously.
Yeah, but it's entirely down to beekeepers, between them and their conscience, how they actually do it. I know quite a lot actually recommend that 5-day gap, but I'm not going to suggest you do that, just because it isn't what the wrapper says, and I'm trying to get across to you, read the wrappers and instructions.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Di. Sorry.
Okay,
thank you.
That's all right.
Can I just say to Chris, please, Di, if you've just got a vaporizer, make sure you go and buy yourself a half decent or a decent respirator, because the oxalic acid smoke is absolutely lethal. It's really, really strong and horrible.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I've got a good respirator mask, and I saw a woman in Lidl at the start of the first lockdown wearing one just like it, and I thought that was a bit overkill, but there you go. So that's oxalic acid treatment in the middle of winter.
Do you need the same sort of respirator if you're trickling it on?
No, because it's the vapor, the gas of it that will take your lungs away. Okay. And you will know you've breathed it in, because your lungs will hurt and you will suddenly have a lot less oxygen to play with.
Right.
And I've watched someone do it whilst holding the breath, whilst they've got a respirator in a bag, and you just wonder. Well, you don't wonder, they're stupid at that point. You've got a respirator, you've spent quite a lot of money on a respirator, why on earth are you not just using it? No, I didn't want it. It's like, well.
But they're not expensive though, Diane, because I picked a 3M respirator up from Toolstation, and it was less than £20.
Yeah. Yeah, then I mean,
you can get the filters that click on, can't you? I got them at sanding, and you can get dust filters or chemical.
Yeah. But this is 20 quid sat in a bag that isn't protecting your lungs, and it is madness. So anyway, hefting hives. They have, by the looks of it there, took the roof off to heft. You could heft with the roof on. If it's all strapped down, you've just got to be aware that most roofs weigh a lot. If you heft and lift your hive stand, you have to be aware how much your hive stand weighs as well. But you have to know how much food is in your hive the first time you practice hefting it, so that later in the year you know how empty it is. And I think it's quite easy to put an inspection board in and see where they're eating honey from, and be aware that they need honey to move to. So if they've ate honey and worked their way into a corner, the chances are they're going to isolate themselves. And you can do that really simply by cleaning your varroa inspection board, putting it under your hive for a couple of days, and having a really careful look at it and seeing where those little white specks of honey uncappings are, compared to the brown ones that are from a brood uncappings. But I think hefting is actually quite heavy. It's hard work and it is a bit difficult to gauge until you've got the hang of it. But it's definitely something worth having a little go at, perhaps. But don't tip your hive over and drop it out everywhere, because that'll do you no good. So putting candy on your hive, you can put it above the crown board if your bees are directly under the crown board. If they are in a corner, you will be much better off rolling it out and putting it on top of the frames, so that is directly over them, so they can just come up and munch a bit and go and survive the winter. There's no point feeding them if you're not putting the food near enough of them. And I will say in this picture as well, we'll ignore the fact he's got no gloves on, but he has got a wedding ring on. And I always say, don't wear your jewellery when you are inspecting your bees, because if you get a sting on that finger and it swells up, then you've got a very limited amount of time to get that ring off. And if you go to hospital to have that ring cut off, they'll be a bit mean to you, because you're a bit of a nuisance, really, because you shouldn't have been beekeeping with your jewellery on. But they have to cut them off usually, and that's going to cost you money to get it fixed. I don't wear mine at all, actually, because during the summer they get took off and put back on, took off and put back on. It was much easier just to put them safely in a box, and I should really put it back on because I'm not going near my bees for a while. But there you go. Don't wear jewellery.
On the subject of fondant, Diane.
Yeah.
I just read on a couple of comments on the groups. There's other groups that I watch as well. That in the winter, when they put the fondant on, the heat from the bees, they'd found that it had melted and trickled down the frames. Is that common?
It will be if you are using fondant as a feed now. Fondant should be an emergency feed, and your bees should have enough food to see them through at least until after Christmas. And if they haven't, it's because you took all their honey away and you didn't feed them enough sugar back. So I have too read about people having drippy fondant in the hive, and they might well clean it up before it drips out the bottom, but the risk is if it drips out of the bottom and other bees come and find it, then they'll know for sure there's a nice source of food in that hive, and they might start robbing it if they want some dinner. So it's about feeding the right thing at the right time, and it's too cold now for sugar. But if you were still feeding sugar, it's because you started feeding too late or you took too much honey.
Go on, sorry, I didn't.
No, go on.
There is a point at which you stop putting the fondant on. What seems to have happened, I think, is the heat from the cluster of bees. The heat has risen up and softened or melted it.
Yeah, because it's not really cold and the bees are probably not eating it. If they were all working away at it, they would be eating, as the moisture in the hive absorbs into the fondant, that there would be bees feeding on it. If they don't need it and it's preemptive emergency feeding, then the bees are just ignoring it, and it won't have enough bees taking the liquidy bits away. So that will just drip down. It is purely feeding fondant at the wrong time.
Okay.
Diane, is there any benefit of putting it in a miller feeder so it can't drip down, so they can go up if they want it? And
if it's very, very cold, they're not going to make that journey. That would be the problem. And then if they need emergency feeding and it's very cold, you need to put it as close to them as possible.
Gotcha.
And if you do that, the risk of taking the crown board off to put the fondant where the actual cluster is, it's chilled brood, I believe. Do the adult bees is it not such an impact cold-wise on the adult bees? Is it just the brood you're worried about in that case?
It would just be the brood, and if you're not taking frames out, there's very little risk, and you're going to be quick, which is why I said roll it out beforehand. And if you carry it out on greaseproof paper, then you can have it quite, not really fat to go under a crown board. But it might be you actually need to have an eek. You take your crown board off, you put a lump of fondant right over them, you put an eek on, you put your crown board on, and then you put insulation on top of that and put your roof on, or another eek or something to insulate the top. But if you're faced with emergency feeding to stop your bees starving, it is better they get a little cold and have a load of sugar than to not have any food. So don't be frightened of them getting cold for 10 minutes while you mess about putting fondant on, because they will eat some sugar and be able to warm back up, but without the sugar they can't. So, but when they need it, they will be eating it as it gets wet, and then it won't drip through. So I know lots of people applying fondant right now, and I think it's just too early, and it either means they've not fed enough earlier, or the bees just are ignoring it because they've got a brood box full of stores.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that, Diane, because I've had to, I don't think I fed my bees enough syrup after, when I took the honey off, and I've had 5 of my hives where they've actually decimated a complete Tupperware box full of fondant.
Yeah, I mean that's the indicator. If you think your bees are hungry and you put some fondant on and in a week it's all gone, they are hungry. If a week later it's absolutely untouched, they are not hungry because they've got plenty of their own food. Yeah. So it's one of those.
I put some fondant on because I was worried that they were hungry, and they haven't eaten any, but I've left it on. Do you think I should take it off or leave it?
I'm tempted to say leave it rather than messing about with them and getting yourself a winter sting. So
I feel better with them having it.
Yeah, I mean that's why I suspect some people have done it. But if it starts dripping down, then that can cause them a problem. But
is it an idea to put something under the hives? I've moved my hives along the garden for a bit more sun.
You shouldn't keep anything under the hive all the time. You can put a board in for a couple of days to see where they're moving to. But if you leave it in for a long time,
the hive to just on the ground level, just below the frame, the stand, and then you can see if it's coming out.
You could, but put the Varroa inspection board in, and you'll see what falls on that, and you can always take it out and wash it. But people are quite often tempted to say, oh well, if leaving the board in for 3 days is good, leaving it in for 3 months is better. And after 3 months you've got an inch of debris out of your hive and loads of wax moths that just go and crawl up and eat all your honey. So
I've got 2 hives, both are bringing in pollen at the moment. One hive's eating loads and loads of sugar syrup. The other hive hasn't even touched it. And I've actually trickled it down onto the frames before I put it on top of the crown board.
I would assume if they're not taking it, they don't want it. And I'd be taking sugar syrup off now. I know you're on the south coast nearly, but it's a bit cold here at night to be giving bees liquid food up here.
We're in Torquay, so it's fairly okay at the minute.
Yeah. So maybe we'll talk about feeding again at some point, because that's been quite an interesting one to go through.
Yeah, what I was worried about, if I took it off and they started eating away at their stores, they wouldn't have anything to overwinter them.
This is the thing, we need to give them about 28 pounds of stores, up to 40 pounds. And if you get £5 in a brood box frame, then that's 8 frames. So you need to have looked in your hive in sort of the middle of September to see how much was in it, to say they've got 6 frames already, I probably need to feed them 2 or 3 bags of sugar's worth of syrup, and then you stop feeding as it gets colder. But until you've done a couple of seasons, it can be a bit hard to know by hefting, which is why you actually have to look in the hive as well, to be able to count the frames with honey on.
I've taken the coinage splitters off and left a full super on both hives.
Right, well, take the sugar away if you've left them a super. Trust me, they will have enough food.
Well, even though one's still eating all the sugar syrup?
If they're still taking it, then I'd leave that one. But the other one that isn't taking it, I would take that off.
They've taken nothing for about 2 weeks. Another one's got through 2 lots in 2 weeks.
Yeah, they don't need it on if they're not taking it.
Okay, thank you.
If you've got a full super of honey as well, then that's going to be enough food for them as well.
Yeah, because there's about 28 pounds of 30 pounds of honey in a super. So as long as they've got stuff in the brood box as well, they're going to have plenty of food.
Okay.
So this looks at Again, some of the checks that run the other one, but concentrating on feeding, heft and add fondant at the start of the year, and come March and April you can give them liquid food again. This mentions oilseed rape. We don't have any here, but most places you can start queen rearing in May as long as the weather's good, and you don't need your big coat on, but you need to have seen that they're starting to lay drones, and that's your clue that the season's kicking off properly, because they're putting energy into making little boys, and when they do that they're going to have one thing in mind. So swarming, yes.
You have there in March. You have there in March. First super on light feed. Is that thin syrup? I know I keep asking this.
Yeah, that'd be a light feed, which is a 1-to-1. The idea is the bees can use 1-to-1 more easily than 2-to-1. And to be honest, there's someone who's done some research saying it doesn't actually matter if it is liquid sugar and it's not really runny. They will gobble it up and they will use it, because they take nectar that is as low as 5% sugar. So if you made up a 5% sugar solution, it would be a tiny amount of sugar, quite a lot of water. And that's what they would use. They would concentrate it down a bit and they would eat a lot of it. But they can use it for turning into food, so they can use it for anything else. And some people are particularly precious about getting the sugar, the right concentration. And you really, don't leave crystals at the bottom, because that will give the sugar something to condense onto and create beautiful big crystals if you do it right. If you remember chemistry at school, I think it was copper sulfate, the traditional experiment for making crystals, and you change the temperature at which it cools, the speed, and you get bigger crystals, and you can do that with sugar, and they can be really pretty, but the bees can't eat those big crystals and they tend to block up the feeder holes in lots of types of feeders. So we want a nice liquid food for them, and we do that early in the year to give them a bit of energy. If the weather's a bit rubbish, you can give them a bit of food and it'll help them get going. Quite often they'll go on.
Sorry, yes, no, I'm a bit March, the first super on and a light feed. So you're going to end up with feed in your super.
I think it means if it's undrawn. This is a slide from the course in case. And if you're going to feed with a super on, then that isn't honey, that is sugar with nectar. And you shouldn't be selling that. But quite often you might want them to draw some comb. So we do need to feed them usually. There are people who do a shuck swarm or a Bailey comb change starting in March. And for around here, that's much too early. The weather's usually shocking in March.
Yes.
But if they need food, feed them. But when you've got,
Not with a super on.
No.
Unless you actually mark that super and it's going to go back to the bees and not be extracted.
Yeah, and some people do that. They keep that super for winter, and they say that is the bees' food because it's mostly sugar.
Yeah.
And then the season progresses with you doing lots of lovely beekeeping, lots of inspections, some swarm control, maybe making some nukes up. And then you're taking your supers off, and then you start your feeding process again, in uniting colonies down that are healthy when you have got too many queens and you want to reduce the number of hives you've got. And you start all that winter process of getting your mouse guards on, checking your stores, make sure you've got your feeding done by October, and basically leave them alone. Don't go through the hive. And I saw someone doing it fairly recently, and I think they're claiming to be a professional beekeeper. And if they want to play in their bees, that's fine. But my recommendation to you in your first couple of years, your inspections will be too slow to even think about doing a quick inspection in November. So don't do it. Put a board underneath and you can really see what's going on in the hive, and you can watch the entrance, and they're both non-invasive ways of having a look at what's going on in your hive. And they're much better for the bees than ripping the roof off and having a poke around. With really big risk, if you inspect your bees in November and you accidentally kill the queen, they're going to really struggle to make a new one, and you've doomed that colony by meddling. So don't meddle when they can't make a new queen. I think that's a fairly good rule.
I was thinking about, I haven't done it, but I was watching one of the, is it Stuart Spinks, the guy that does the podcast and thing, and he's got like a weekly video thing, and he was putting on mouse guards this week, but I was catching up and he put these, I can't remember what they're called, but they're like clear crown boards, which I actually got with my poly hive, and I was like appalled by, like, it's kind of ended up in the back of the garage. But he's put them on so that he can lift the lid and have like a count and, just a little kind of snapshot. So I was thinking about putting one on the next time it's not pouring a rain and freezing here.
You can, but each time you take the lid off, especially on a polyhive, which are quite thick and good insulation in themselves, you will let some heat out, because that poly crown board is not likely to be as insulative as the one you've got on now. And if it's going to make you go and meddle with your bees more, then should you be doing it? Because the temptation then is, and I've read this today, somebody's posted a picture with an eyebrow up here, because they went and had a look at the bees and they've got a sting for the trouble just because they were stood too close to the hive. And if you're going to put a suit on, and when you go and lift that up, that's fine, but you don't need to look down on them. I know some people really want to go and look at them. Enjoy them from the outside, and if you want to know, put the board out and have a look at it and draw it, and then the next time you do that, draw it, and you'll see them progress through the hive and how the brood shrinks and they eat honey from different bits. And that's a really interesting exercise that perhaps we should all do and compare every week where the bees are. So clearing the honey off, clearing the bees out of the supers. You can get clearer boards, and these are generally very effective, and some of them will work in a couple of hours, so you could put them on the hive in the morning and take the supers off in the afternoon, or you can brush the bees off. You can also buy something called, is it Hive Away, that you spray on a cloth and you put on the super, and it drives the bees away, and it's got, I think, almond essence in, and the bees don't like it, so they run away from it. But there are different ways of clearing the bees off, and I've never seen parcel tape round a hive before, so I'm not quite sure why that's there, and if anyone knows, that would be really interesting to know. But clearing the supers you do normally at the end of August, September, when you're going to take your honey off.
That parcel tape is probably covering a gap.
Well, I was looking at the gap between the hive and the boxes underneath. That looks a bit more of a gap than I'd like, and it's usually indicating there's a lump of wax somewhere where it shouldn't be. That's stopping the boxes sit down. But this was on a slide called clearing, and I thought I'd ask if anyone knew why you might put bodge tape round, or parcel tape, whatever that is. So
mentioned about brushing the bees off, and I can't remember whether it was Stuart Spinks or somebody else said that they didn't like using the brushes because they tended to roll the bees. Any views on that?
If you have a super that is fully capped, there will be a lot less bees in it than one that's got open honey, and that's generally a sign the honey's as done as it's going to be. But to cap it, they need to have bees on it. So I've brushed bees off every year for 6 years, and the year before that I didn't. I used a clearer board only. But the bee inspector said to me, oh, you could take these frames off now, just brush the bees off. There's not a lot of bees on it when it's all capped, and it's really quite quick and easy. And you don't have to make a second trip out.
Yeah.
And you can shake the bees off, but that's quite hard work once you've done 3 frames. But brushing them, it's quite easy. If you brush them down into the super you've took the frame out of, or in front of the hive, then they're not going to bounce up. But if you just brush them on top of frames that you're then going to move on to, you get a lot more bees in the air. I
would imagine if there's only a handful of bees on there, it wouldn't be too bad. I think this guy must have been talking about brushing them off full framed, you know, bees, and he says
my bees are generally very, very tolerant of me brushing them as well. And whether that's because I've got really nice bees, I don't know. Do you want to come in there, Chris? No?
I brushed some of bees. I caught a swarm and it was on like a water bird bath thing. So it was a beautiful height, but they obviously didn't all want to go in the box. So I used my brush. It's the first time I'd ever touched bees outside my own box.
Yeah.
And they did not like the brush.
Right.
At all. I absolutely, it's put me off using the brush ever again.
So some bees don't. Mine are very, very tolerant. It's just one of those things, I think. So
I've seen people using clumps of leaves and doing that, but I can't see how that's any worse than a brush or better than a brush.
Goose wing.
Goose feather. Yeah.
goose feather. Now I've tried that and it's rubbish. I'd much prefer a brush. Maybe the goose feather wasn't enough, but someone I know had geese, gave me some feathers. I got individual feathers. This person wasn't cutting a wing off his goose for me.
You've got to wait till you kill the goose.
But it's nearly Christmas. Maybe someone will bring me a goose and leave the wings on. So anyway, uniting. This is when you use newspaper to combine two hives. We'll do a full session on that in the spring. Because it's a really useful thing to do if you've got a limited amount of hive space.
Is there any particular newspapers they prefer? You know,
they don't like the sun, and I've been paid to say that by someone from Liverpool.
Broadsheet is good to be.
Someone is just joining the meeting. That is wildly optimistic. It is an hour and 23 minutes after it started. We have still got far too many slides to go. We have done far too much chatting. So I'm going to whiz through some of these, I think. Feeding of bees, we have talked about. Autumn feeding is what you do after you've took your honey off. Emergency feeding is what you do with fondant after they've run out of the food you've given them in autumn. And spring feeding is what Francine asked about, is putting feed on a hive in March. And that gets them going, and you might want to do that in February if you've got oilseed rape, because you want the colony to build up really well. So there are different types of feeder. You can invent them with plastic bags in a couple of prick holes. You can use round feeders, contact feeders, frame feeders, and a very odd gadget that you put into the entrance. And I have one and I never plan on using it because it looks insane.
Like a bird feeder.
So yeah, mixing sugar syrup. Never use anything other than white granulated sugar. And the reason for not using anything other than white granulated is that's the cheapest. It has no impurities in. If you use brown sugar, it's got rubbish in it. That is fine for humans. And we quite like putting brown sugar in our coffee for some reason, but the bees do not need that. Don't boil it. And there's an MBU leaflet that explains all about stirring it and doing this, that and the other. There's a picture of someone using their jam pan for making syrup, because when you make syrup, you're going to want a lot of it. That's a miller feeder. That's a really good way of getting a lot of food onto your bees quickly. You fill it, and somewhere it suggests on the leaflet from the MBU to use a watering can to top up feeders. If you're going to do that, you want it to be a nice clean watering can. Don't use one that's had any weed killer or anything in, because that would be a terrible idea. Don't spill it in your hive. I know someone who spilt sugar using a contact feeder because he left his wife to put the lid on it, turned it upside down, and he should have checked it because they're his bees, not hers. And she hadn't put the lid on it right, and the sugar went everywhere.
Go on, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
If you spill sugar, you've got to clean it up, because otherwise the wasps will come and find it. That's the candy picture again. Don't wear your wedding rings when you're going in the hive. And then very quickly,
If you make sugar syrup,
Yeah.
How long can you store it? If you made it and put it
There's something on the MBU leaflet that I would rather you read on their leaflet than me try and explain about mixing thymol up, because it doesn't dissolve in water. So
No,
you have
I'm
to
talking
do
about
something
sugar
to it.
syrup. You know, just a couple of kilos of sugar with some warm water, and like you made it. How long can you store that for? If you
It's in the leaflet. It
Okay.
doesn't give you a specific date, but if it says if you're not going to use it straight away, there's something you can do to it. But I will post the MBU leaflet with the link in.
Yeah.
And it's put in some thymol in, but in a special way. So anyway, honey, pollen, water and propolis. Honey comes into the hive in the form of nectar, and that's the carbohydrate, and that's what gives the bees the energy to go out and collect more. The pollen's the protein, and that's what they need to mix with the sugar to build up the food to make the baby bees grow. So they're both really, really essential. And a colony can bring in over 100 kilograms of pollen a year and well over 150 kilograms of honey a year. They will just use an awful lot of it to feed their babies. And the bit they leave extra is why we call them honeybees, because that's spare food. Water helps cool the hive or dilute the honey. And so it's got two purposes. It helps with the air conditioning. And the bees go out and collect water on a hot day, which is why they need a water source. And they will spread this round on the frames in the hive. And then when the wings get fanned, this evaporates the water and it has a cooling effect. And in winter, they need it to dilute the honey. So on a bright sunny day in winter, you might find a lot of bees drinking from a puddle. And that usually tells you they're uncapping a lot of honey and need to dilute it, because they need it about 50% water to honey to be able to actually use it properly for food. And propolis is a wonderful substance that is really gluey, but it's antibacterial, got lots of other properties, and it comes from coniferous trees, and it acts as a glue and a varnish and a shine, and it is absolutely amazing. And it's one of the things that makes your hive smell really nice. I've got 2 hives that make so much propolis, I should be taking it out by the gallon and selling it. But instead, I just fight to get the frames out and unglue them on a warm, sunny day. It's very sticky. But if you inspect your hive in cooler weather and you have to jemmy the crown board off and it cracks, that's usually an indication that you've broken a propolis seal, because they will use it to deal with any drafts. So if you've got boxes that have got little tiny gaps in, they'll seal them up with propolis and make the box airtight for them.
Please, can I ask a quick question about pollen?
Yes.
If you have a really mild winter and you've got a very prolific queen and she's going to be laying through the winter because it's warm and that's just what she's doing, is there a case for feeding extra protein?
No.
No,
they will bring in plenty of pollen unless you live in an area that's really terrible for bees. I think that was Heather wanting to say something as well. Heather, was it not?
Yeah, I was just going to, sorry, my thing's gone unstable. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, because my thing came up unstable.
Yep.
Just a quick question. When you said the propolis is a good polish, have I misunderstood when the bees are polishing the inside of the cells? I assumed that was just cleaning them up. Do they actually put propolis in?
They use propolis in there to sterilize each cell, which is why when you come to melt down brood combs, you get such a lot of rubbish and there's so little wax, because the wax becomes such a tiny part of the frames, because it's the excretion of the larvae when they join the stomach up with the end bit. That gets expelled as well, but they propolize inside the frames, and that's what helps make them shiny, I believe.
Okay, I didn't understand that before. Thank you.
So, robbing. This is something that happens if you spill sugar in your apiary. if you have drifting and bees discover that another hive's got plenty of food in, they might go and rob that. If you're going to feed, you are supposed to feed all the colonies in the apiary at the same time. Don't leave one out. And the idea of doing it in the evening is you can set it up in the day, but don't put the sugar in until the evening. And that's because if you accidentally spill any, the scout bees that will be out looking for easy pickings will go and find that and discover where it is, and they will go and gobble it all up and rob the hive out to get at it. But this is what we were talking about before. The bees that fly in confidently think they're going to the right place, and so they get let in. The robbers come in with an erratic flight, and they will be more, I don't know, they will argue perhaps with the bees on the entrance and then start fighting. And the guard bees, once they've seen a bee they don't know coming in, they have different modes of defense, where they will just be watching casually, then they sort of stand more on the back legs so the front legs are ready for grappling, and then they the next stage is where they'll make contact with the other bees and they'll bite them and they'll fight them, and you can see that sometimes at the entrance where the bees look like they're proper wrestling, just trying to stop the other bees coming. Putting a sheet of glass in front of the hive can stop them coming in, because the robbers are a bit more stupid than the bees coming out. And as we said, lots of grass in front can help them as well. But putting a wet sheet over a colony can help. Go on, who was that?
It was me, Steve.
Right, go on.
Steve in Wigan. If you've had quite a few hives on one apiary, so in a circle, could you put like a feed station in the middle and let them help themselves?
No, because they'll fight over it. They will defend. If you have a bait hive, because this is a much better example to talk about, because this is something that isn't a risk to your bees. If you put a bait hive out and two lots of bees discover it, they will fight over it at the entrance. And the reason you don't want them fighting over food is the fight will carry on until there's no food left. And when there's no food left at that feeding station, they will look for the next source of food in that apiary. And the chances are they've already started robbing it before the last one's gone. So bees are really good at smelling honey, and they're very keen on an easy source of food. So there are some people who show open feeding, and I think they all need shooting. And if there's anyone here who open feeds, then I don't like what you're doing. It's horrible. It's a really bad idea. You will lose a colony eventually to it. You can spread disease. It's really not good. But there are unfortunately some people who think, oh, well, it doesn't hurt. They're only my bees. How do you know? How do you know it's only your bees going on whatever it is you've left out? You don't.
Yeah.
So you can cover a colony up with a wet sheet if they're really badly robbed, and then move them in the evening, or you can move the robber. But it can be very destructive, and the risk is if you don't move the robber colony, the ones doing the robbing, then they can actually rob other hives after you've moved the weak one. So it can be a proper nuisance. So we want to avoid doing that as much as possible.
So is that a complete 3 mile move?
Yeah, it would be, I think, because otherwise you'd have flying bees fly back and you'd deplete the weak colony. But this reckons move the besieged colony somewhere, and that relies sometimes on having somewhere to take them to if you've not got an out apiary already. But reducing entrances is a good idea if robbing starts, but the best way is to avoid it starting by making sure you don't do things that can get the bees interested in what's in another hive. So winter food is £40 to £50 there. The guy up in Rossendale weighs his hives, and he's calculated over a number of years they never eat more than 28 pounds of honey. If you've got a set of scales and you want to weigh your hives every week and do the same experiment, you can. it's an interesting one, and some bees will eat far more than that, but you will probably know that they don't make very much honey. Someone I know had very yellow bees, and they just ate absolutely everything that came in and turned it into more bees, which was great for making bees, but rubbish for feeding themselves when the weather turned. And a standard frame, as I said earlier, weighs about £5. So to get 40 or 50 pounds, you need quite a lot of frames. That's at least 8 frames full of honey. So you need to weigh how much your bees have got and feed accordingly through September. If you've not got balsam, if you've got a good crop of balsam, the bees will feed themselves and give you a spare super or two as well. And there is an MBU leaflet about feeding bees sugar, water and pollen and substitutes, and that's on the National Bee Units thing, and I will post the link to that shortly. And there's the leaflet about sterilising hives. If you find this page with all the leaflets, I'd recommend you download them all, put them in a file on your computer, and when no one's looking at work, print them all out. And or if you've got a printer at home, you could do it at home. But there's absolutely loads, and some of them I think are a bit wasteful because they've got sort of diagrams and things in pictures. And I'm a bit of a miser where printing in colours concerned, so everything I print is generally in black and white. I'm not suggesting you rob the printers at work, but if you were allowed to do the odd bit of printing at work, you'd certainly find it cheaper than doing it at home. There's tons of really good books. If you've got a Nook or a similar e-reader thing, you can have them all as PDFs on there and just carry them around with you and read them when you've got 5 minutes spare. There's absolutely tons of stuff, but the sugar one's well worth reading. It's got about adding thymol in there to do that. And that is slide number 33. And it is nearly 9 o'clock. It's been lovely. Thank you all very much for this evening. If you would like to buy me a coffee, then my link is on my Facebook page somewhere. I will stay behind for 5 minutes, but I'm going to have to pour myself another drink because I've talked myself nearly hoarse. I will put less slides in for Wednesdays because clearly 33 is too many. So I will add some links to things, and I will find the photo of the colony in the apple tree. Go on. Someone said my name then. Was that Kirk?
Thanks, Dan. Halloween.
Right.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye, gang.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
Dan.
everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yes, it's on my Dye & Drink Water Qualified Beekeeper page. I posted it last Sunday, I think.
Everybody left then when you said buy a coffee.
I need it on a mug or something, don't I? So I can just go.
Yeah, that's better.
Go on. Who's
I just ask, are you using bee smokers as ornaments?
I am. This got mentioned. I was briefly on the exam board meeting this morning, and one of their members said we must mention Diane's smokers because they seem to be breeding. So I said, well, this is what happens. You buy 2 smokers and you leave them together in a room, and I'm going to have some baby ones for Christmas.
You've got another one behind you.
I have. This is my stainless steel one though. So.
Anyway, thanks for putting up with everybody's questions tonight. It's dragged on far too long for you, I know.
I mean, I am aware of how much talking I've done, so I will make my slideshow shorter. I thought I could whiz through loads of things on that. I've done that. This session has been an hour-long session with real people, so clearly you're much better at coming up with questions than the people I taught this to in real life. So maybe that says how lovely you all are and questioning.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.